Do it, Russell Christian.
Yeah, I'm
this
ready.
is Russell Christian. Say, all right, I'm giving you the cue. There you go. Now say,
Hang
this is
on,
Russell Christian.
my video's all messed up
Okay.
here. All right.
All right. Okay. Now I'm going to point at you. We're already live, but I'm going to point at you, and you're going to say this is Russell Christian, and you're watching the Break It Down show. You ready? Here we go. Bam.
This is Russell Christian. You're watching the Break It Down show.
On the podcast, none of that shit ever happened. I'll cut that part out, but when we're live, you know, so whatever, right?
Yeah.
I love it, man. I love talking with you and the other people on baseball Twitter, baseball X, whatever you want to call it. It's great to just dig into these stories, dig into people. And I know you know this with your show. You'll dig into somebody and you'll end up three somebody's over because there's just these amazing journeys that baseball players go on. And it's a lot of them are just remarkable. Like, I don't know if you know the backstory for Kenny Rogers, but no way that guy should have played baseball. And yet he has this marvelous 200+ win career.
I don't know the backstory on Kenny Rogers, but
Well,
I'm a short version of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it should never have happened. He was like, he's one of those dudes was like, no, like there's a divine thing that happens, and it's like you will play baseball, you know.
Oh, wow.
And so save it for people. But yeah, it's so improbable his path. I love Rube Wahlberg from the early part of the 1900s. You know, he went and joined the Coast Guard. He was working for his brother. He was hucking hunks of coal on a coal mound in his brother's coal yard. Bam, you know, and he's like, why don't you go play some baseball? So he does. And then like in his later mid-20s, he becomes a major league baseball player, you know, and he was fantastic. But because the game was so hard to get into back then, reliable, because you got to eat, you know, you got to stay alive back then. I just love those histories.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. That's one of the reasons why on my podcast, I always try to do a bio. Not only does it make it more of a narrative when you're telling the story, I mean, it's largely a statistical based analysis, but it just personalizes the player. And sometimes you find out these amazing things, which I think kind of helped their Hall of Fame case. Like on my Billy Wagner episode, spoiler alert, at the end of my Billy Wagner episode, I made the conclusion I didn't think he was a Hall of Fame. I never thought he was. I've come around on him. But one of the things I found out was that he was right-handed, broke his right arm, and taught himself to throw left. So he's a left-handed pitcher who taught himself to throw left-handed because he's sitting there as a teenager with a broken arm. And so, well, I got to play somehow. That's incredible. I don't know if you've ever tried to, I don't know if you're right-handed or left-handed. If you ever try to throw a baseball with the wrong hand, it's like, you know. So the guy went on to put on potentially a Hall of Fame career with his wrong hand. So it's incredible.
Right. And throw 100 miles an hour reliably with that wrong hand.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's so I'm ambidextrous, and when I throw a baseball, I am two different people when I throw a baseball. Now, I'm more practiced with my right hand. You know, there is some like repetition that you need, but when I throw left-handed, I'm a little less accurate. And this back, look, I can't throw shit now, but back when I had shoulders, I hadn't been in combat for all these years. But the ball moved a little more, like what we kind of expect, and it was not as it was more deliberate. So it wasn't. I couldn't hide the ball as well, you know. Okay. But if you gave me a glove and said go play outfield and play left-handed, I could do the job. You know, and it's a funny thing. So maybe Billy was more right-handed or left-handed than he realized, and it wasn't that hard. But I know back when I was a kid, there's a bunch of kids that did that. Like, hey, my wrist is broken. I'm going to go ahead and just play the other hand.
Sure. They want to play, and that's the thing. You know, all those stories are incredible. Hank Aaron had a story. You know, he learned to play hitting bottle caps with a broomstick and stuff. You know,
right? And cross grip.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, he says when he first got into the Negro leagues, like the coaches were like, "What are you doing?" He said, "That's how I was always hitting." They're like, "You're not going to hit like that anymore." And he was so talented that he probably could have gone to the majors with a cross grip.
I mean, he got
may not have had the same stats, but he would have been good. You know? Right.
Yeah. It's. Do you have a favorite era?
Do I have a favorite era?
Yeah.
Well, it's hard for me not to say the 80s and 90s because that's when I grew up.
Right.
So I'll say 80s. The 80s in particular. The 90s is kind of a loaded era because you get into the steroid era, you get into some things. The 80s, I always refer to the 90s as the home run extravaganza period on my podcast, trying to get a PD. But you know, the power numbers, you didn't have as much of a high home run total, and speed and base running were more of a factor in the game. The era of Reigns and Ricky and Vince Coleman. So I really liked that growing up. It wasn't small ball like in the old days, but it still had an element of small ball with the base running, especially the Cardinals, Whitey Ball, with Whitey Herzog and stuff. So long answer to your question, the 80s period where the best home run hitters in the league, the Schmitz and the Murphys, were getting like 37 a season, and that was good. Before everybody was jacked up and hitting 60.
Yeah.
So
you're right. And that's probably the culmination of a couple of things. One, you had the introduction to black players who just played a different brand of ball.
Yeah.
And, as that became more prevalent, you're looking for guys who did those things. And you do reach an apex, but the apex is also, and all of these eras have a couple of things. So you get the cookie cutter multi-use stadiums that have AstroTurf, and that man, if you've ever played anything on AstroTurf, it is lickety split fast.
It is
like you're faster on it. It's crazy.
Yeah,
and so all these things go together. Yeah.
No, I played. I was just in Atlanta last week, and I was watching the high school football playoffs with my brother and some friends. I played football in high school, and we got to go to the Georgia Dome. It's blown up now, but we played a couple of games in the Dome, and it was turf, and it was wild. Don't get me started. I like football on the grass. I don't like football on the turf. I like football on the grass and the mud. But it was fast, and I was like, ooh. It makes you realize how slow you are when you're on the turf.
Yeah, man. Yeah, especially if that ball's rolling, and you're like, I'm never catching that ball. I played. So I did a lot of PE in college. I played soccer, and this is just PE level, nothing else. But man, you could kick that ball, and you didn't have to dribble the ball. You just had to stay by it and monitor it, and it was a totally different kind. I'm not saying bad, but a totally different kind of soccer where you could, do different things.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're playing grass and turf, whatever, soccer, baseball, football, completely different game, completely different style. Absolutely.
Right.
And you're right. Those multi-purpose stadiums, a lot of those in the 80s, which were really ugly, but they had turf and wrecked a lot of guys' knees. I mean, Dawson, that was the big thing. He played on the turf.
Yeah.
Really hurt his knees, but it was a different way of playing the game for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing I guess I would say about turf is when you go down on it, like when you're a kid, like I'm a diver, like I like, like I'm going to go for it. And I was like, oh, I don't dive on turf because that shit will tear you apart. Like it's one thing to get a burn, but you go against the grain and it's full cheese grater. And you're just
it hurts. And there's no, I know there's padding underneath it, but football, you go on the ground. Right. It's nothing like a cushy grass with the dirt, and it's like, you hit it, and it takes the sting out a little bit. You hit that turf, and it's like, wow. Ooh,
man, if you go down on your shoulder, there's a pillow there, but you quickly max out that pillow's squish, and you're just like, it's a different game.
I always have a negative connotation of turf because of hearing some of these 80s stars that their careers are cut short, but growing up in Atlanta, Falcons fan, I don't remember Jamal Anderson. We went to the Super Bowl with him. I think it was the first game of the next season, a non-contact turf injury, which essentially ended his career. I was like, seriously, guys? We can't have a grass stadium in Atlanta where it's like 70 degrees in November, you know?
Billy Sims, same kind of thing. Billy Sims was a legend, and he got turf toe and just couldn't. That was the beginning of the end. Could never really put. Running back is a hard position anyhow, but it's crazy. So I want to ask you about the 90s because you talk about. We call it the steroid era. I don't think that is an accurate name. I think that too simplifies. Sammy Sosa's in the news right now.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm all about Sammy Sosa getting the Hall of Fame. I'm fine with it. He hit a load of home runs. How many home runs did he benefit by taking steroids? Is it 10? Is it 60? Is it 100? We don't really know, But also, let's not forget, there were 2 rounds of expansion, during his career, which always brings the offense up. There was they went from don't lift weights because it'll bind you up to everybody lifting weights, whether or not they were adding anything to that or not. By the way, all the supplements back then had steroids in. It wasn't regulated like it is now.
No.
There was the use of video. Remember, Tony Gwynn pioneered that, and everybody's like, oh my God, Tony Gwynn can hit. I better do video. So that came in, and you started to be able to see patterns. And then statistics started becoming in, and the better eating go with the working out. All these things happened from the late 80s to the late 90s. All that stuff came on board. All of these abilities to make your your coaching better, your fitness better, your strength better. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, dudes hit a lot more home runs. Were they also on steroids? Sure, but how much of that was steroids and how much of that was all these other things? By the way, strike zone changed, ball changed, you know?
Yeah, that's the thing too, and nobody talks about whether the balls were juiced. Remember, and that kind of started with '87. They always called it the rabbit ball
Right.
year, where I
Yeah,
remember as a
rabbit
kid
ball, yeah.
reading baseball cards, you're like, man, these guys are all, hitting a bunch of home runs, and people are getting home run totals that they never matched. But it's funny you say that with supplements, because I remember, I think it was '95 or '96 when I was in high school. I started lifting weights when I was like 12. This is like early '90s. So I've been a gym rat most of my life. And creatine hit the scene like '95, '96. And everyone took it. And it was funny because I remember in high school, like only one or two guys on the football team usually could bench 300. Creatine comes around one spring. Half the guys on the team are benching 300. I was taking it and I got stronger, and I stopped taking it because I was like, what's in this?
Right.
I wasn't sure. We now know it's safe and people take it, but yeah, all that over the counter stuff. And that was kind of the thing that during the steroid era afterwards, people were saying, why do you need to take it? Because if you're working out like crazy, diet, taking creatine, branched chain amino acid, like you'll get jacked.
Yeah.
You'll already get jacked. But
yeah,
I'm not defending, but I'm a reading Game of Shadows with Barry Bonds, stuff like that. It's like all these guys were doing the same thing. So to get that edge a little higher, it's like the creatine ain't going to cut it. Lean steak and turkey, we're going to take that edge. And so to your point, like these guys would have hit a lot of home runs, and we're hitting a lot of home runs, but
right. Ballparks got smaller too. There was a lot less foul ground, and so just a lot of changes came on board. And by the way, Barry Bonds worked out as good as you could possibly work out. He hired a chef. He tested his blood, every single thing. There's a certain thing when you get to a level, I'll just call them psychopaths. Like they're able to disassociate from everything else, and they're just like, I'm going to only do this, and I'm going to be the best at it, And so he did all those things. So every advantage that could be taken, he was taking it, and so he already was great, And then you add a boost, and then all of a sudden, it goes crazy.
Exactly. It's funny because talking about Game of Shadows, as I read that, it's admittedly a hit piece on Bonds, but the flip side is you can read it and say, this guy is obsessed with being the absolute best athlete and baseball player possible. He was already an incredible athlete. He was already an incredible baseball player. And he was, the narrative, and it's kind of true, is like he saw McGuire, so he saw all this stuff and was like, hey, I want in on this. Don't forget about me. I'm the best. And he just set out to be the perfect athlete. And the steroids were part of the component, and the numbers, I'm not justifying, but he put up some incredible numbers, and he was putting up good numbers before those, and would have put up good numbers without him. I don't know if he would have hit 73 home runs, but because that's the thing too, talking to friends or athletes, is that it's not necessarily the muscle mass that helps you, because everyone says, even Jose Canseco says, if you can't hit a baseball, you're screwed. Go to the gym and find a bunch of bodybuilder dudes that don't play, and put them on a tee.
Go start a softball team.
You still got to be able.
Well, and there's a great case study: Jose and Ozzy. Ozzy wasn't a good baseball player, not good enough for the majors, at least, And so these guys are the same dudes. They work out together. They look the same. They're genetically the same, and so it's that different. Just
it's funny you say Ozzy. Difference. I saw Ozzy as a kid. The Huntsville Stars, with a AAA team in Huntsville, Alabama, for the Oakland A's. My family is from Northern Alabama, so we go visit cousins and stuff. We go watch their games. When we saw all those A's stars coming up, and we went to a game, and Jose was already on the A's, and he was the biggest player in baseball late '80s, but Ozzy was on the team. So we were kids, and we were all excited for Ozzy Canseco. And I think he went like 0 for 4 with like 3 errors. People were booing him. It was bad. We were like, wow, he is not as good as Jose Canseco.
Yeah. And then it's horrible because you're like, hey, he's a really good baseball player. He's just not a major league baseball player. So we get really hard. That's another thing is, especially on X, you'll see a lot of this where folks will take a piece of the truth and make it into like a farce, and you're just like, what are you talking about? Like the other day was, maybe you were in this conversation. We were talking about great outfield arms. And for sure, without a doubt, Barry Bonds had a great outfield arm, for a while. And then you get older, and that's just not his strength anymore. But he had this move where he would go down the line, and man, if you weren't 100% committed to going to second base at first base,
Yeah.
he's going to get you. And he has like 7 seasons of double-digit assists from left field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he made athletic plays in the outfield too. That's one of the things, when Willie Mays passed, I've said on my podcast before, I think he was probably the best 5-tool player, although Barry Bonds may be better, just in terms of how he could play and the fielding, play in the field, his arm. It was incredible.
What do you think about, so as we look at the Hall of Fame, and it's evolving, it always does, Sure. I'm not sure I'm 100% convinced I'm right on this, but there are no aces anymore. We're looking for attributes of a pitcher who gets a lot of outs without contact. And those pitchers tend to not be able to do it year to year. They don't pitch 200 innings. They can't finish what they start. They can't go through the lineup 3 times. These are all things that aces do. They're the alpha. They're the stopper. And I'll just pick on Blake Snell. He has won the Cy Young a couple of times, and he was a great pitcher that year. But really, what he's great at doing is getting strikeouts. If you ask him to pitch into the 6th inning, he's not the best pitcher anymore.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because that's probably the thing that has changed the most about baseball since we were kids growing up is the way starting pitching was handled. I remember Tony La Russa, this would have been like late 80s, early 90s, maybe mid 90s, but I remember reading the paper, Tony La Russa was going to limit every starting pitcher to 5 innings. And I remember thinking, that is so stupid. It's revolutionary now. I mean, nobody goes past 5 or 6. And part of the reason I've mentioned on my podcast a couple of times, I don't know if you read The Arm, Jeff Passan's book about Tommy John surgery. And there's this emphasis on velocity. And it's tough because you don't want to say take a velocity away because that'll change the game. But just with the emphasis on velocity and the fact that every guy can pretty much throw 95, 98, it's hard to sustain that for 6, 7, 8, 9 innings. So it's easy to say. Some of the old time pitchers, I like reading what they have to say. Like, I pitched 25 complete games. It's like, yeah, but back in those days, it was not unheard of that, you run out of gas in the 7th inning and, your fastballs are only 88 and you're trying to get a slider. And so it's just a different game. And for that reason, to your point, like, it's so hard to evaluate current, when I say current, like 21st century starting pitchers based on prior stats, because they're not going to get the big win totals. They don't have as many innings pitched, and it's more of an advanced statistical analysis, which gets me to scratch my head because, like, you're talking about Blake Snell. It's Snell and DeGrom, 2-time Cy Young Award winners. You look at, like, DeGrom doesn't even have 100 wins. If he retired tomorrow, I know there's people on Twitter X are going to be like, he's a Hall of Famer. And I'm like, great pitcher while he pitched, but I play the what if game sometimes. It's a slippery slope where I reevaluate MVP and Cy Young votings. And I don't remember the season off the top of my head, but there's one of the seasons DeGrom won. Max Scherzer led the league, I think, in innings pitched and wins and strikeouts and DeGrom won. And I'm like, man, Scherzer got robbed because not only was he putting up good analytical numbers, he was also carrying freight. Whereas DeGrom is doing well in these small outings, and it's not his fault. That's just the way the game is played. But I don't know. I mean, this is.
But you would call him a fragile. There's no way around this. He is fragile. He is injury prone. He is not durable. Right. And I'm not saying an innings chewing horse, someone who goes out and like a Lance Lynn was, he's one of those kind of guys, or Sean Estes, where it's like, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to give you innings. Every now I'm going to surprise you with a great game. But my job is to help absorb innings. I'm not talking about those guys. We're talking about, Scherzer, Kershaw. These are like true aces that when you bring them in, you're like, this guy's the guy we can put out there. And we know that all we got to do is score 1 or 2 runs today. And that's it, because we're going to break this losing streak. That DeGrom is not that dude, and Snell is not that guy. And then when you hand your work off to a bullpens are way different now, and it's full of these elite arms. You can have 5 elite guys in your bullpen, and it is very tough to navigate that. But I don't know, like at some point, and I've been working on a little writing piece about non-closers who are Hall of Fame grade, right? Because they're out there. We just don't see them because it's already hard to see the closer. And now you don't have a guy that's notable, but he is the guy that goes out and has a whip of point 0.8, whatever, like
Yeah.
not even one, right? And high strikeouts, and doesn't have wins, doesn't have a lot of holds. Just he just goes out, and for that inning, forget it. You're not going to get a hit, right?
Yeah.
And that sounds like a Hall of Famer to me. If Mariano Rivera can go out, I can look at Mariano's numbers. Yes, he's got the closer job. Yes, he's in New York City, but if your numbers are anywhere near Mariano's, and Mariano's the greatest closer ever, well, then I don't care what inning you pitch, you're a Hall of Famer, unless you're a starter. And then all of a sudden, Pete doesn't know what to do with you.
It's funny you say that. So I haven't done the episode yet, but an episode that I will be doing in the future is Jesse Orosco, and he fits that mold because he wasn't getting the save. He wasn't necessarily the closer. He was like the 7th, 8th inning, pitcher.
Yeah.
If you look, and people, if you take this out of context, you're going to think I'm crazy. But if you do a stat comp, Jesse Orosco versus Mariano Rivera, of course, Mariano Rivera is all-time save leader. Jesse doesn't have as many saves because lots of times he wasn't in a save situation. But if you go straight, innings pitched, earned run average, strikeouts, I'm not saying that Jesse Orosco is better or as good, but their stats are eerily similar. Down to the and it's wild. Whereas
it is.
And of course, Mariano Rivera is the only unanimous Hall of Famer. Jesse Orosco is not, and probably never will be in. But it shows you, okay, if you get this save stat, which just like wins, they can be a little, they don't tell the whole story. He's a guy that I'll do my episode about Jesse. Just go look at his stats compared to Mariano's. It's fascinating. And another guy currently who I think fits that mold is Jesse Chavez on the Braves. He's been on every team. He doesn't get enough credit. He just goes in and throws strikes. And he'll go in the 6th, 7th inning when the starter's in trouble, and you'll always get an inning or two out of him, and it's clean. And it's like this guy. So this gets into a greater conversation about analytical stats. These are the kind of guys for which analytical stats was really born, to find value in some of the non-aces. So that's why, and sort of piggyback on our Chase Utley conversation this year, that's why when people put all their weight in the Hall of Fame conversation on analytical stats, it's like, these are stats that were intended to look beyond the numbers, to find value in players, the Jesse Oroscos, the Jesse Chavez's. Say, he doesn't have a lot of wins. He doesn't have a lot of saves. Yeah, but if you look at these advanced stats, he's the guy who will come out and you'll get 3 up, 3 down in the 7th, 9 out of 10 times. And he's not going to make an all-star team. He's not going to win any awards.
Right.
But he's dependable,
Yeah.
Those are the guys that you want on your team,
No, they are. And there's a number of these guys that they shock you when you see the number. And the instant you hear this, you spit the bit. You're like, there's no way that's true.
Yeah.
And then you're forced to deal with the fact that, well, no, like Sergio Romo, just like Chavez, man. If those two Vatos are in your bullpen, man, you got dudes that will sling and they will fill any role. When Romo strikes out whoever it was for the last Giants World Series win, that is a bullshit little. I call him a cat burglar because he comes in and he steals your shit with that bullshit little slider, and I'll be damned. His career numbers are ridiculous. I mean, and he's hiding in plain sight. And I'm not even talking about the guys who have even better numbers. I'm just saying, go look at Chavez's and Romo's numbers, and you're forced to. Yes, Jesse Orosco was a left-handed one-out guy. He was a loogie, right, for a long time in his career. Who's the other Mets closer from that era? John
Franco.
Yeah, same thing.
He has the save totals. He has a high save total because he was getting the save. But same guy.
Right. But afterwards, he just kept ringing up left-handed dudes.
Yeah,
it's like if you wanted to look bad, go take some cuts at him left-handed. And is that not Hall of Fame? Like if you can hang around to your mid-40s like Jesse did and just keep doing the same job and just ringing fools up, I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that because that's another conversation is like, should a one-dimensional player, get in the Hall of Fame or win awards? We just saw
Right.
Shohei Ohtani win the MVP as the designated hitter, first time a designated hitter
Yeah.
won. It's like, yeah, I would say when they have a 50-50 season, yeah, they didn't play in the field, but you got to give a guy the MVP, So
Yeah.
same sort of argument, if you see a one-dimensional player, but they do that one dimension very well.
Yeah.
I mean, look at Mariano Rivera.
Yeah.
Arguably, don't
One
bite my head
pitch.
off. He was a one-dimensional player. They brought him out in the ninth
Yeah.
inning. He pitched an inning.
Yeah. One pitch, not even one dimensional, like one skill,
Yeah,
really.
literally just threw the cutter, threw 9 cutters, and the
Well,
inning's over. And do that 600 times, and you're in the Hall of Fame. So,
the other guy that is amazing, and I put the cut at about 600 innings, and I'm looking this up right now because I don't know the numbers off my head, but Darren O'Day is death on hitters. And
yeah,
it's just like you look at his numbers and it's like, well, that's a Hall of Fame pitcher. He's got 600 innings. And look, could a Hall of Famer have less innings? Yeah, maybe. And maybe 600 isn't enough. And I'm glad to have that conversation. But what you can't deny is that you couldn't get on base against him. And it's not one number. Like ERA plus is 1.67 for his career.
yeah,
That's stupid. Just comparable are like Kershaw, who's obviously a better pitcher because he's an ace and he fronted the staff and he's one of the best pitchers the last 100 years. His ERA plus is 1.56.
wow.
So, maybe one day you'll catch up to Darren O'Day, and Papelbon has this huge ERA plus. There's a lot of guys that I think we'll see the point where we'll have to get some of these dudes in. Maybe they won't get on the writer's ballot, but you can't deny that if their job is to get dudes out, they did it as good as anybody ever has.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because relief pitching is a relatively recent thing since really the 70s.
Right.
Think of like Mike Marshall pitching over 100 games and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
Hoyt Wilhelm was really kind of one of the first big known relievers. And it took like Hoyt and some of these guys took a while to get in the Hall of Fame because people were like, even some of the guys in the 80s, Lee Smith, look how long it took him to get in the Hall of Fame. So there was, I don't know if it was a bias or just relief pitchers didn't have. They did, they're not hitting the home runs. They're not the Mickey Mantles that you grow up idolizing. But people that are into baseball realize these guys are valuable players. It took them a while. It still takes a while for relievers to. I mean, look at Billy Wagner. He's one of the best, left-handed relief pitchers of all time. Yeah, I think he's going to get in this year, but he's been a borderline candidate. And so, to your point, okay, look how long it took to normalize like relievers getting in. Middle relievers.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't think of any middle reliever that's in the Hall of Fame. And it's going to be a purely analytical, review. And now that we're into the deeper analytical stats, I'm just spitballing here like predictions. Yeah, I think you might see in the next 20, 30 years on some of the era ballots, especially as we unclog the era ballot. Parker's in, Allen's in. I hope, Dale Murphy and Tommy John and some of these other guys all get in so we can sort of clear the ballot. Yeah, we might see middle relievers like Darren O'Day or Jesse Orozco. I mean, I'd have to look at the advanced stats, but it's tough because you don't have a win total and you don't have a save total. You need a counting stat to hang your hat on, and it's purely analytical. I think it's too advanced at this point for Hall of Fame voters to start voting guys like that in, but I think you will. And once you get one or two, then the floodgate's open. So
the floodgate is open. Yeah, it's going to change. It always does, and that's good. Yeah. Change is good. But then we do have these problematic guys like, like Billy Wagner, like Chase Utley. I don't think Chase Utley is a Hall of Famer. If he gets in, I'm not against any of these guys. I'm the first guy to say, I hope that dude goes to whatever team is going to pay him the most money, and he just stacks cash. I am all for everybody getting their 10 years so they get the full retirement. I'm all for all of that. I want these guys to stay healthy. I want everybody to do great. I don't root against any team. I don't root against any player. I want them all to do great. But if you're going to tell me that Chase Utley is a Hall of Famer because he had a high peak, I'm willing to listen to that. But I just don't buy it. I value presence when I think about the Hall of Fame. And this is I just said 600 innings might be enough. So I'm glad to be a hypocrite because we all are. But I don't see Utley. So I was messing with WAR the other night. And this is not complicated stuff. I'm not a statistician or anything. But you can go, okay, how much WAR do you accumulate per game, per month, per whatever it's going to be? You can calculate that. And what I realized, and I normally say that WAR is silent on durability. That's not as accurate as it needs to be. WAR is a bad measure of durability.
Sure.
It is a cumulative stat at its heart. It's still, you have a negative WAR, but we tend to worship WAR. We talked about the MVP vote. I don't think Ohtani was this year's MVP. I know he was a great player, and I'm glad he won the Hank Aaron. I think that was suitable. But when you get a unanimous vote and you get the Hank Aaron and the MVP, and I don't know about that when the Mets were in fourth place in their own division in May and had to come back and play great ball. So when I see these evolutions where like we rely on WAR so much, and the difference between 7.8 WAR and 6.2 WAR, it's nothing. It's nothing. It's not there.
When there's a positional adjustment, so it's like you're putting the numbers already, So yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, and those numbers just kind of guesses, and the replacement player themselves, it's not a true zero value, and so it's like when people bash Jeter's defense, they don't. I'm going to be a dick for a second here. They can't tell me what mean, median, and mode mean in stats. Yeah. And they're just like, oh, he's terrible. He's the worst fielder ever. Like, no, he's not. Greg Luzinski was in the outfield and was terrible. Gary Sheffield couldn't play shortstop. These are guys who are worse shortstops. There's guys that get pushed off the position. He played for 20. If you told me that you can hire a guy who's going to have Hall of Fame offense at shortstop, we'll use WAR, 77, 80 WAR probably for this guy over the course. You're going to win multiple championships. He's a clubhouse leader. By the way, beautiful dude, well-spoken, represents the brand well. He'll help fill the stadium. And by the way, his defense, it's maybe a little bit below average.
Yeah, you take him. You take him.
For 20 years, he's going to play 2,600 games. Oh, yeah.
Not everyone can be Ozzie Smith at shortstop. Human highlight reel. You just want someone who's good. You're like, okay, he's good. Yeah, we could trade him and have some platoon scenario for the next 10 years, some guys that are better. But yeah, he's the leader, and there's intangibles plus his offense. And he was never a big home run hitter, but he had multiple seasons of 200 hits. I mean, he always he was a good hitter, pure hitter. I think he had a little occasional pop, but you want any team wants a Jeter. Same thing with Chipper. Like one team. He had a few seasons where he did have a lot of home runs. He, I think 465 career, but there were a lot of seasons he'd have like 21, 22, which is still pretty good, but it's like he'd bat 310 or 315, clubhouse leader. It's like, and I don't know Chipper's defensive stats off the top of my head, but I remember just watching him and he was pretty good.
Right.
Sure. Maybe he wasn't the best, but there's a trade-off. Right. You want the leader. You want the guy with the bat. I'm with you. Yeah.
The other day I did. So when I look at these things, like first off, I think it's dumb to consider the greatest third baseman of all time, but it gets great engagement and it's interesting to talk about. So I like to talk about it. But because I really, there is no difference between Adrian Beltre, who I think is the GOAT, and say Aramis Ramirez. There's just no difference between everybody in between those two. They're all incredible. They all did. So again, maybe we get our stats thing out. The bell curve, right? Those guys are on the flat side of the bell. They're just like, they're all, you're lucky to get a person like that. So that's the first thing. But when we're desperate to pick like the best third baseman, like, all right, well, let's look at it. And, Chipper has a penalty of not playing as many games at third as, say, Adrian Beltre, who I think is the best. Yeah. And when you comp them on the years when they were both like 24, when they were both good and established in baseball, because Chipper wasn't reliable before that, and you go all the way to, say, 38 years old, their numbers just are not that different on offense. They're just not. And the difference comes in the front end of Beltre's career, where he was surviving as a 19, 20-year-old playing starting third base for the Dodgers. That's just so ridiculous.
And the thing is, Beltre, again, talking about that steroid era, it's like Beltre was one of the many players, one of the casualties, I should say casualties in the Hall of Fame, but one of the players, one of the impacts of the steroid era is that players who had great seasons are kind of largely, those seasons are forgotten because, McGuire, Sosa, Bonds, these guys are doing this incredible stuff. It's like, I forgot that guy had, 6 seasons of 30 home runs or something like that. Look at, was it named Eric Karros, the Dodgers, had multiple seasons, 30 home runs, 100 RBI, and I don't think he ever made an all-star team, So it's like, these are numbers that in the 80s would have been leading the league. This guy might have been multiple-time MVP. But, Beltre, I mean, it's apples and oranges to go who's the best third baseman. He's certainly very good. I mean, defensively,
Yeah,
I'd say Brooks Robinson. I'm biased to
sure.
George Brett, just in terms of
Yeah,
pure
yeah.
hitter, with a little bit of power. But
So, okay, this is the question. So, I'm not against George Brett. Obviously, I love George
yeah,
Brett, and he was a great third baseman. Not a great glove, but a great bat, right?
yeah, yeah.
But he only plays. I think it's only right, only. But I think it's like 14 or 1,500 games at third.
Oh,
And then
did
you
he?
got Brooks, who's played like 2,800 games. And
Yeah,
again, I'm guessing on the numbers; they're not in front of me. But we're talking, 1,000 games difference. Can
yeah,
someone be so good that they don't have to stand there for 1,000 games? Now, if you're going to say baseball player, that encompasses all of it, right? Defense, wherever you played. So is George? George is not a utility player, but is he a multi-position guy? Because he plays, like a third of his games are at first and DH, and the other 2/3 are at third base.
yeah, yeah. I think to your point, yeah, he had a good glove, but wasn't like he wasn't Brooks Robinson level, and especially towards the end of his
Right,
career, putting up first base and designated hitter. But he was there for his bat. I mean,
right.
let's be honest. So,
Yeah.
um,
But is he a third baseman or is he something else? Chipper too.
I
Chipper's got a
qualify
lot
as a
of
third
games there.
base.
Yeah. Okay.
It's funny you
So
say
then
that.
it,
'Cause- Go
yeah.
ahead.
No, you go. You go. You're the
I was going
guest.
to say this was the discussion that came up, and I talked about it on my Joe Mauer episode. I was about this close to saying I don't know if Mauer's a Hall of Famer. Of course, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, so what do I know? But my
Yeah.
issue was that everyone was saying, "Oh, great hitting catcher." It's like he didn't play that many games at catcher. He played a lot of his career at
Right.
first base and designated hitter.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that was my only beef. It's like when people are saying he's one of the greatest hitting catchers, and I believe he
Yeah.
had the highest, he still has the highest career batting average for a catcher. And I broke down his stats on my episode per, catching. And it's like the
Yeah.
guy, I don't even think he has the minimum 10 years of service time required for the Hall of Fame at catcher. So it was
Right.
kind of almost a half
Right.
and half thing. I don't have the numbers memorized off the top of my head, but it just,
Yeah.
it kind of drove me crazy because you'd see, oh, Joe Mauer, legendary catcher. I'm like, legendary
Yeah.
catcher
Yeah.
/ first baseman. And if you're going to
Right.
grade him based, once he gets into the first base category, you have to grade him another first baseman. It's like there was a lot of other better ones, when you start
Right.
stacking up his stats. So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I even said it at the end of my episode. Look, the guy had a great career, 3-time batting
Right.
champion, MVP, hometown hero, 15
Yeah.
seasons all for the same team, grew up in Minneapolis. I'm like, he's going to get in. He's a likable guy. Sure. I don't have a problem with that, but
Yeah. Predicted to be great, was great.
yeah,
In from his hometown. Yeah.
drove me crazy because everyone's just like, he's a catcher. I'm like,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, no, but I'm with you on that. Like, you don't get to accumulate third base value standing at first base.
Yeah. Yeah,
And this is
exactly.
where I'm hard on George Brett. So I'm hard on look, is Miguel Cabrera, is it Miggy? Is he a third baseman? Because he played third base. He
Yeah.
went there first. And they're like, what, you got to go to first
I
base.
think of him as
But
a
he
first
wasn't good
baseman.
enough to. Yeah, he wasn't good enough to play there, so he got moved to first early in his career. Pujols, same thing. They're
Yeah.
like, maybe you're a left fielder. Maybe you're a third. You know what you are? You're a first baseman. Okay, well, their glove wasn't good enough to go play that position. That is a negative value, right? These
Yeah.
are all-time greats with their bats. There's no denying that. But don't tell me they're a third baseman and give him extra credit. So I think that's where I'm at with George. And I'm glad that George's in the Hall of Fame. He should be in the Hall of Fame. The third baseman with the most hits, though, is Adrian Beltre. Even though both those guys have 3,000 hits.
Yeah.
There has never been a third baseman with 3,000 hits. No one has stood at third base and gotten 3,000 hits because Beltre's got DH time, right?
Brett's hit total was including first base and DH. I got you. Yeah.
Right. So when we give those WAR points and everything, I want to back up and go back to WAR. So I was messing with WAR and calculated, like I did a lot of small calculations to kind of sort this out, decisions to make it fair and beneficial to the player. So like if you weren't firmly established or, you were subbing in, I didn't force you to have to eat those early years in your number. So this is when you're established. With some players a little harder to do, there's some fudging in here in the numbers. But when you take that WAR per game and you miss 1,000 games in your career that your team would have played or did play, to me, there's a negative value that you have to add into WAR because you can't just get credit for showing up to work and not have anything happen when you're not there. When you're not there, someone has to play that position.
Exactly.
The team has to account for you. So, like, I'm pretty hard on Otani. I think Otani is great, but I'm pretty hard on Otani because number one, he shouldn't be stealing bases. I know he can do it, but you inevitably get hurt. That's the actual academic research. You're going to get hurt when you do these things.
I think this is the last season that he's. I don't think you're going to see him stealing much anymore. Now
and you only get so many shoulders and elbows before you start to degrade significantly.
Especially after that hit in the World Series, and now that he's pitching next year, I think he's done stealing. Yeah.
Do you remember Mark Pryor got into a little base running incident with was it Mark Bellhorn, and that ruined his career. This is just a thing that looked fairly, but I mean, considering what you can see on a baseball field, fairly benign. And Mark, he never recovered from that thing.
Yeah, it's not.
So when you're not there, when Mark Pryor is not on the mound, someone else has to pitch.
Yeah, and they got close to $1 billion invested in this Otani guy, and he's supposed to be pitching again. That's all. Not to get off on a tangent, but he's so goal driven, and he has set his goals to win the Cy Young. It didn't take a rocket scientist. I predicted, so did everyone else. I predicted this past year when he wasn't pitching, he was going to have a monster offensive season. He did.
Sure.
I think he's going to have,
while he recovered from Tommy John, which is
assuming he's healthy, and I hope he is because I love watching him. I think he's certainly going to go out and try to have his best pitching season. Right. Whether his arm cooperates, we'll see. But he's in terms of box, he's got 3 MVPs. He's got all these home runs, 50-50.
Yep.
He's going to want to go out and win 20 games and strike out 300 batters and get a no-hitter and all that kind of stuff this season, I think. So,
yeah. No, but that's – and he has that potential, right? But when you go for something, when you try to jump over the Grand Canyon and you don't make it, there's a cost, right? So, I want him to do it,
I like, and I know you're talking about it on Twitter this week. I like the idea of factoring in playing time in WAR because I'm old school, and I talked about this on my Dale Murphy episode and my Steve Garvey episode. It's like these guys had these consecutive games played streaks. I think a lot of people that are into analytics don't care about that, but especially once you get into your third, I remember when it's like a lot of people lifting weights in my 30s and I'd be stretching and I'm like, oh my God, I pulled a muscle. I'm like, that's what happens when you get old. You lift up a gallon of milk. Oh my gosh, I think I pulled a muscle. It's like, and they're playing 162 game seasons, So I think the games played should factor in for sure, because at the end of people don't realize, especially younger fans, it takes a lot to get up in the morning and go to work as you get older, whatever your job is. And when your job is to be a professional damn athlete, lacing up, I feel like crap, you wake up and you're like, I didn't even work out yesterday. I'm sore from sleeping wrong. When you hit that age and you're suiting up and not only playing, but doing well, it's like that counts for something, because in your mind as a player, you're like, I'm hurting the team if I don't play. So I'm going to play to give the fans what they want, give the team what they want. That's one of the intangibles that has to be factored into the consideration, and that WAR or any stat doesn't. Well, I guess consecutive games played or games will show you that stat. But you got to be able to factor that in for sure, because there's guys that take time off. I'm reading the Ricky Henderson biography right now, there was a lot of Ricky was a brash person. He butted heads, and they talk about it. There was a false narrative that Ricky, didn't like to play and only did want to play morning games after night games, whatever. And they dispel that in the book, because they said he played, 148, 150 games that season or whatever. But nevertheless, the narrative, driven a lot by some of the teams that didn't want to pay him as much, was that, you're not a team player, you're only playing in the games you want and doing the stats you want. So, and I don't want to name names. There are players I think that do that play 130 games a season. They're like, I don't want to. We just had a long flight to the West Coast. I'm going to sleep in. Y'all play tomorrow. It's like, no, show up, get your butt to the ballpark and play the game.
Yeah. And if you need to rest, that's okay. Yeah. But there's a tabulation for that, right? And so, for example, I ran the numbers on Utley. And again, these are really raw numbers, so I'm just giving you an idea of how this works. But Utley in his career, I have him at 38.3 WAR. He loses about 20 plus WAR for being injured, and so you could, he had 3.8 WAR in 2010. Well, he also only played 83 games.
Yeah.
So,
and
it's
that's
like,
the thing. We get into Utley. Let's get into Utley. It's funny because I've been doing this podcast now for about a year. I've got the Twitter X account and a Blue Sky account, which I use to get a conversation started to drive traffic, the podcast.
Right.
I was traveling, visiting my family last week, and then I think I told you I flew back to Vegas. Then I had to fly up to Reno for depositions.
Yeah.
Oh, well, so the past week and a half, I've been living out of a suitcase and living out of my phone. And of course, that's the week when this Chase Utley post I put on Twitter blows up. It's got like 100,000 views. Every time I'm on airplanes and landing and checking, it's like 60 comments. I'm like, oh my gosh, everything's blowing up. I'm not at my computer. So we got to talk about this because I haven't even. I'm looking through. I'm like, I need to go back and address some of these comments. I'm trying to address a few as we go along, but the long story is I've never seen a compelling case for Chase Utley for the Hall of Fame that doesn't go way down a rabbit hole of analytical stats, and I still don't see it. Right. I mean, WAR is really his only case. I broke it down on my episode. If you look at him in all-time second base, he doesn't lead in any second base categories.
Right.
And if you're starting to say, well, second base is underrated or undervalued in terms of, or underrepresented is what we're looking for in the Hall of Fame, I'm going to come at you with, well, I think Jeff Kent belongs first. He's got the most home runs for second baseman. He's got an MVP. And I just put a comp right before our episode, put it here with Kinsler, Pedroia, and Utley. They're all on the ballot. Utley has the highest WAR. He's got 64.5, but Pedroia is 51.9. Kinsler is 54. I mean, those are pretty close. And, Pedroia's got a higher batting average on base percentage. So it's like you've got three players. I think Utley probably had the best statistics, but comparable players. And I'm like, I don't see Kinsler and Pedroia as Hall of Famers. I don't think a lot of people do. So I'm just not buying. Go ahead.
Kinsler and Utley are so similar, when you do look at, gosh, there's not even like 5% difference between these two numbers. And so if you're going to tell me, and I like to use Holiday as a comp for Utley because they are very similar careers in terms of totals. And I think you and I were in this exchange, and I don't get mad at people disagreeing because the whole point is if Holiday is one and done, then how is Utley something else? Like,
I saw your exchange, and I saw some of the critics. And for what it's worth, I always say in my episodes, I love the discourse, but everyone, be kind. And some people aren't good at arguing or debating; they get a little nasty. So I try not to engage. But it's like whatever. But I saw a critique of your comp, and that was fair, saying, "Hey, Holiday's third base, Utley's second, apples and oranges." That's fair because second baseman, and we talked about it too. I think I was talking to you on Twitter how Utley was shortstop and he didn't have a strong enough arm. And there are other second basemen that got into second base for that reason. It's not a knock. They eventually find their position, but second base. I like comparing positions to positions, unless it's a player like you're talking about the George Brett situation, a player that's like, this guy can swing the damn bat. Find him somewhere on the field, where he'll do the least damage. Those are the players that I'm like, I don't really look at their defense because I even talked about this in my Ken Boyer episode. It's like Boyer finished at first base. Like that's where they sent people before they had the designated hitter. They're like, go play first base, catch the ball.
And the position thing, I understand, like if you can hold something there, but you don't, you're not bound to that, right? So you can't compare Holiday as the outfielder to Utley as the infielder because there are, ways to do that. And it does matter if you end up in left field because you weren't good enough to play center or right field. It does matter if you migrate from short to third to second base because that is that's where you hide things, right? And so you're a bat first hitter. You're going to go play second base. That is great, but you are a bat first player. Let's not talk about. And then with Utley, they're like, oh, you had to see his defense. Okay, but every shortstop's better than him. on
Yeah.
defense on his team. Otherwise, he'd be playing shortstop. Every third baseman is better than him. Otherwise, he'd be playing third base. And by the way, I don't want to hear about base running. There's no way any base runner is so incredible at base running that, because you can count the amount of time. You could literally go through every single game he ever played and go,
Yeah.
right there, he took an extra base. Right there, he took an extra base. And what's it going to be? Is it 100 times in his career? Is it 50? Is it 250? Because if you don't know that and you haven't done the work, this is when the numbers fail. When you go back and you read the breakdowns of the games and you see what happened and why Tejada wins an MVP. Andre Dawson doesn't win an MVP because he had the best numbers that year, because he didn't. He had great numbers, but he won the MVP because all the writers are like, fuck you owners for doing that to these guys. He won that thing the second he handed that blank check across the table. Now it's like, all right, now I'm going to go show you. So there's a lot of things. It's not just the numbers.
Yeah, and talking about, if you look at the number, we do have numbers that quantify, base running. You got stolen bases, and I have to throw triples and doubles in there. Utley has, I'm looking at stat, 154 career stolen bases, highest in a season ever has 23. It's like, okay, yeah, he's got a little speed, but
right.
If you're going to say, oh, he's one of the greatest base runners, like, I disagree. I'm like, did you watch Vince Coleman? I'm like, and I'm not saying Vince Coleman should be in the Hall of Fame, but the dude, like, that was his whole thing, man. You look at his double, he has 411 career doubles through 3 seasons over 40. That's really good. Highest career, you got 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons of 6 triples, but none of that jumps out at me as like, yeah, this guy just had wheels and could run the bases. It's like, that's such a, when you go to, it's funny because last year and now this year, the posts that get the most engagement are Utley. He's got a hotly debated Hall of Fame case, and and I love to see, I'm not being critical. I love to see it because the Phillies fans, I mean, objectively speaking, I always make Philadelphia sports fans are, even by their own admission, the worst, but I love it. It's like, you love to hate, the Phillies fans. I'll give them credit. I got a lot of friends that are Phillies fans. They're a passionate fan base. And I'm like, I'd rather have a passionate fan base that we're like butting heads than, fan base is like, oh, I don't care. It's like, do you care about your team? So, you have passionate Utley fans. And I think what it is, and I get this because this is how I feel about Dale Murphy. I think you got a lot of people who are now in their 30s who grew up with Utley as, being their favorite player. He was one of the best players on this, Phillies team that won a World Series. And so now the nostalgia kicks in. It's like, no, how can he not be a Hall of Famer? It's like, I can objectively see why Dale Murphy is not in the Hall of Fame yet. I think he will be, but he had a low batting average, didn't hit some totals in terms of the home runs and the hits. And I'm like, I understand objectively why voters in the past didn't vote him in. Now I'm biased, and I think he should still get in for some other reasons. But that's long story. That's what I see is going on with Utley. So that's why I love to see it. But the Utley conversations are so impassioned, and sometimes people are getting a little angry. And it's like, I say it. There's an account on Twitter X, the Warmonger. I've had some good conversations with him. I think it's a geek guy, a big Phillies fan, and reposted my Utley episode and was like, "Hey, this guy's a Braves fan. He digs on the Phillies, but he was complimenting me. Provides an objective episode on Utley, breaking it down." Yeah. And I'll say it like 1,000 times. Like, I don't dislike the guy. I love that story that was being shared the other day about how when they were doing the service time manipulation, he looked in the locker room and said, "Y'all don't ever want to win." He just left. Yeah. Like, that's a badass attitude to have as a player. I like Utley. It's just like, it's not personal. I'm like, I just don't see him as a Hall of Famer. I don't even. Here's the two things, because these are two categories, just real quick. When you look at, was he the best player on the team, or was he the best second baseman in the league? And to me, the answer to that is no. And I talked about this in my Utley episode. I don't even think he was I think he was the third best player on the Phillies during their era. I think Howard, who could have been a Hall of Famer but just fell off the cliff, Howard and Rollins were arguably better players than Utley. So it's like he was the third best player on his own team. And you look at the best second baseman of that era, I think Pedroia probably was better, even though he had a shorter career. And Kano was probably the best, but might not get in the Hall of Fame for other reasons. So
sure. Yeah. And there are also a lot of infielders from that era. You only get so many slots. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, if we elect 2 people a year over 20 years, that's 40 dudes. You got to cover everybody in there
Yeah.
in those 40. That's
Yeah.
it's
So
not
in
easy
terms
to
of
do.
Utley, I know it's like a passionate thing, but I was looking at the numbers. So last year he got just so we know, like we're not just making this up. Let's see, he
Yeah.
got 28.8% of the vote last year as his second year.
Mhm.
You know, in terms of numbers, you got to start off the guys that eventually get in, even on that 10th year, will usually start off 34, and trend upwards.
Right.
I don't know. And here's the thing: the next two seasons, I'm not to skip ahead, but I did a little research here.
Yeah.
The next two seasons aren't really wow in terms of the first ballot Hall of Famers. Next year, you got Cole Hamels. Um,
Right.
I think he'll eventually get in. I don't know if he's a first ballot guy. Ryan Braun, too, who's not going to get in because of PEDs.
Right.
In 27, you got Posey, Buster Posey, who'll probably get in. John Lester
Mhm.
has a good case. I don't know if he gets in. But in 28 and 29, you got Pujols, Yachty,
Oh boy.
Miguel Cabrera, Joey Votto. So, like,
Gonna get
starting in
crowded.
28, you're going to
Right.
see some stacked ballots. And I think unless Chase Utley gets in the next 2 years, he's going to get lost in the mix. Because what I see in the next 2 years is I think, excuse me, Carlos Beltran and Andrew Jones are going to take advantage of sort of the lack of an Ichiro
Yeah.
caliber player for the next 2 years. And those are going to be their seasons to get in. So,
Yeah, because they're running out of time, those two guys, and if they're going to get in. I want to go back to that service time thing. That is, because one of the guys said, look, and everybody's got to have their arguments. I'm not against any
yeah.
of that stuff, but it's not the same as World War II service. It's not the same.
No,
'Cause
no.
I give credit for sure for work stoppage. If you're fighting to, or you're being locked out, that's why I say work stoppage instead of strike. If you're doing that and you don't get to play because you have to reconcile something with the owner first, that is a higher order than the game. If you have to wait because Placido Polanco and David Bell are ahead of you, established major leaguers who are guys
Yeah,
who are comparable to you, that is not manipulation of service time. That is the organization going, hey, you know what? And what do? They move Polanco out of town.
yeah,
They traded for that dude, and then like, you know what? At least got the check. But you have to earn that. And
yeah.
so, yes, baseball teams absolutely can manipulate service time, but not for years. If you're
No.
good, you'll play. And I put this in there they advanced him they skipped him 4 levels. He got
Yeah.
there fast.
Yeah.
But like we all said, he went to college, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But that counts. Time missed counts,
Yeah.
And we struggle with these things. I'm with you. I love that he's got a passionate fan base because that's what you need to get elected. And those guys might turn the tide. They might find some number. And I've looked, when I see these things, I'm like, maybe I'm wrong. Let me make sure I go. And I go back in and I'll read newspapers from the time and I'll dig in. And one of the things I found that's sort of in his favor and sort of not is I ran a report on how many people have this many seasons of 7 WAR, right? Because that's incredible.
Yeah.
And he is one of the top 20 guys in that. Well, he's in the top. Let's see. I guess he's in the top 29 people because there's a lot of ties in there. But everybody around him is a brilliant Hall of Famer, right?
Yeah.
To include Joe Morgan, who is a second baseman.
Yeah.
And Joe is great than Utley.
And Joe, here's the thing. Joe has incredible advanced statistics. He also has really good counting stats and led the league. I'm a big fan of like players who lead the league in a lot of categories, led the league in a lot of categories. He had, off the top of my head, I think he had over 500 stolen bases, a ton of hits, just like
MVPs,
MVP, the whole package. I'm not seeing one thing, and I want to be clear because I think one of the great things about Hall of Fame voting now is because we have advanced statistics and different ways of looking, because we have Baseball Reference at our fingertips and stuff. The old era of counting stats where the only way to measure is out. And it's like, they're still great, like Beltry and Ichiro. Like you get 3,000 hits, no PEDs, you're in the Hall of Fame. That's absolutely. But the fun and exciting, discussion is these borderline players, and I like the fact that you don't have to hit magic numbers to get in. Look at Todd Helton, who had an incredible career batting average, on base percentage, all the stuff. Didn't have the 3,000 hits, but it's like. Or Mauer, so these guys with shorter careers but are doing more in that career are getting in, and I'm fine with that. But I just also look at Utley and I'm like, he didn't have, to me, a wow career. Even though it was shorter and he didn't hit a lot of magic numbers, he was just kicking butt and taking names during that time. He was doing good, but doesn't lead the league in a lot of categories. I'm looking right now. The only so he led the league in runs once. He led the league in hit by pitch 3 times. And we got into a conversation about this on Twitter where people, I kind of make jokes about it on my podcast because like for my Dave Parker episode, I was stacking like his career hits, home runs, RBIs. I'm like, these are like basic building block counting stats. But I laugh sometimes because I see people online saying, only 6 players have X amount of, attempted steals, left field put out. I'm like, you have this bizarre combination of stats that you're like tweaking to make this guy look better. And that's what I feel like was happening with Utley, because that one post that I responded to, like, extra base hits, doubles, whatever it was, and hit by pitch. I'm like, take hit by pitch out of there. It's a fun I go into that in my Utley episode. It's a fun rabbit hole. Like, dude, this guy got hit by a pitch a ton. I did a little rabbit hole about the guy with the all-time, hit by pitch record. But I'm like, that to me is not a Hall of Fame. It's just a fun baseball story. And if you're using it to boost his case, I'm not buying it. I will say the only player, not to get off on a tangent, but the only player I think the hit by pitch total matters is one of the players who luckily got in the Hall of Fame before I started my podcast. That's Minnie Minoso, who was, I believe, the first, Black Latin American player in baseball and led the league in hit by pitch like every season. I mean, I don't know the stats off the top of my head. And I'm like, okay, that matters because he was getting thrown at for a reason. And that's part of the story of Minnie Minoso and all those players, a lot of Black players that played in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s. And like, they're facing things that white players didn't have to face. And so in that instance, Minnie Minoso's hit by pitch total matters. But I'm sorry, Chase Utley is not being targeted for his rate. Maybe he just creeps up in the inside of the plate or I don't know. Like, or maybe
he's a hard-nosed player, right?
Hard-nosed player. And he took out, I forget the guy's name, took the guy out, stealing at second base. And so, maybe there was a little bit of a, oh, you play dirty at second base. Maybe he puts the tag on a little too hard. So everybody's like, hey, that's just part of the game. It's a cool factoid, but I don't see that as like a compelling part of his Hall of Fame case.
If Utley goes on and has a long manager career as well, instant Hall of Famer. Like the playing career is so close, I'm looking at the comp right now for Joe Morgan and Utley, and you see the difference. Like, and again, we're using WAR, so it is what that is, right? But Joe has 100 WAR to Utley's 64. Yeah, and that I think says everything. They had the same amount of brilliant seasons, 5-7 WAR plus seasons, but Joe kept playing, and Joe's got hundreds and hundreds more games. Yeah, and that really I think is one of the differences. And 2 MVPs and world titles. They both have 1 World Series, but the Big Red Machine was a better team. It's a different thing. The racism thing I think is huge. Yeah, and you got time to get into this real quick?
Yeah. It's funny because go ahead.
So there's a couple things. One thing I'm going to say is when people use the integration point to say, oh, anybody before that wasn't any good. Like, no, those were the rules of the time, and they played against the best players available. They couldn't play against the other guys. Yeah. And the color barrier is an important time, but it is not an all-defining point in time. Like, you want to talk about things that have changed baseball even more than access to color is, medicine. Yeah. I mean, access to antibiotics has created a lot more brilliance, advancements in surgery, the modern knee surgery. Oh my God. Like anybody can benefit from this. So yes, there was a race of people that were excluded, and that's horrible, and it counts, but it is not this only thing. The access to video, to watch the same pitcher, to see spin on the ball, all this stuff makes the game go higher and higher and higher. So that's the first thing. The other thing is if we're going to use race, let's understand what it means. Okay, so Jackie Robinson breaks color barrier, Larry Doby in the American League, but still you didn't see teams with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 players. There was another barrier there. And Ditmore writes about this in his book about Jim Gilliam. And you can see the impact of that. The Dodgers in, I don't know, like in 52, when Gilliam could have played, but he couldn't because he was black, and the Dodgers couldn't have that many black players, and they were ahead of everybody.
Yeah.
They had Billy Cox at third. Billy Cox, great player. Dodgers, Brooklyn people loved him. But if Gilliam is there, better player, good chance they win and beat those Yankees because he's a significantly better player.
Yeah.
And so there's that barrier that they had to break by. And then it was the coaching barrier and the managing. So there was always this retarding of access to things throughout. And so if you just say it's the integration part, then you've missed that there are a lot of seasons. So Gilliam loses a couple of seasons because the Negro Leagues were deemed to be now a lower league.
Yeah.
So it's as if but it's not listed in his minor league stats, right? So even that, it's like wiped out. It doesn't, and I'm using Gilliam because I've read his book and talked to Steve, and I have a lot of knowledge about that now. But there's a lot of players like that who never even got a chance because they were too old, right? And you're like, I'm 32.
So, that's old in sports terms. Yeah. Well, like Louis Tion's father, that was I talked about in my episode. He was a star pitcher. Monty Irvin said he would have been a great player in baseball, but by the time the color barriers broke, he was too old to play.
Some of these guys were still great too playing. I mean, 32 is old sometimes, but sometimes, and some of the animosity between the races then as well was like, oh, you know what, it won't work. Russell is he is just too cantankerous, and we're trying to run a business, and that we don't know how to work that. And as horrible as that might sound today, we all do things like this. We're like, this person is a problem, whatever color, religion, or they're just an asshole, right? Like you have to run a business. It doesn't justify bad behavior, but these are decisions that these guys have to make, and society has to move at the speed that it moves. We can't put our rules on that society because they're different things.
Yeah, and there's certainly players today. There's always going to be people that are like, "Oh, that guy's not a good clubhouse guy," or whatever. But it's interesting. I was going to say I'm wearing my Dave Parker T-shirt. If you hear any noise,
nice.
To celebrate Dave Parker. But I wanted to bring it up real quick because talking about the color barrier is interesting. This classic baseball era ballot, that topic came up on almost every player because Dick Allen. I talked about in my episode when he got onto the Phillies. I think they had one black player. They were the last team, if I recall, to put have black players field the field. So that's the team and that's the atmosphere he came into. Right. And it's like he's facing something that Chase Utley has never had to face, that Ian Kinsler has never had to face. So, and even Parker talks about that. Even in the 80s, like when he got the big contract, early 80s, he's in blue collar town, Pittsburgh, and then he wasn't playing as well. He says in his autobiography, "Yeah, I heard all you guys, talking to me in the field, and I heard what you said." And this was in the 80s. So, in Louis Tiant, so it came up on a lot of these players, Dick Allen, Louis Tiant, Dave Parker, my episodes. It's like they're facing things that that's why I like to get into the bio before the stats, because it's like you have to realize what they're facing. I mean, Dick Allen, the Philadelphia sports writers refused to even call him by his name. They called him Richie. He's like, "Don't call me. That's not my name." They're like, "Oh," they called it anyway. It's like, he's dealing with all this crap. And I've saw some interviews with Ken Griffey Jr. before talking about Jackie Robinson. He's like, I couldn't put up with the shit that he put up with. Like, nope. I'm like, I don't blame you. Most people wouldn't want to. So, it was an interesting ballot because you had a lot of these players, and John Donaldson and Vic Harris. John Donaldson was pitched before the formation of the Negro Leagues and then came into the Negro Leagues. Vic Harris was a Negro League player and manager. So they're facing things that, players that are on the ballot, the Chase Utleys of the world, don't have to deal with. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, how many, if you read any of Poznansky's recent baseball books that he's written, how many stories where the dad was a damn good ball player, but just can't play ball? I got to feed you guys, And so they teach their kid. Mickey Mantle is one of those guys. Johnny Bench is one of those guys. There's a lot of those, and especially with the Negro League players. I mean, a lot of those guys, their dads were like, "I've got this job. This is what we're allowed to do. This is how we get to eat. So I don't get to play baseball."
Yeah. I talked about it on my Louis Tion episode. His dad tried to talk him out of playing. He was like, "Don't play. The teams won't sign you." And his dad was he was like the Ohtani of Cuba. He was like the best pitcher, known throughout the country. Could have pitched in the big leagues, if there weren't a color barrier. And Tiant showed from a young age, his skills, and his dad was like, "Oh no, don't go down this road." And I kind of joked in my episode of course, is when a father says that to the teenage son, that it almost encourages this son. Kids are always going to do what the exact opposite of what their dad says. So of course he did the exact opposite. And his mother encouraged him. So, okay, mom's on my side. I'm playing baseball.
A lot of stories like that where the dad says no, the mom says yes, or the dad says, whatever, right? And in Wade Hoyt's book, his uncle says no, but Wade's like, I'm a kid, a high school kid. He's like, I'm gonna go play baseball. And so there's a lot of that. Well, listen, it's been great.
Dad saying no just makes him want to do it even more.
That's absolutely.
The teenage boy and all of us. Yeah.
There's liquor and boobs out there. I'm a high school kid. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Listen, I appreciate it. It's awesome, super fun. I love doing this kind of thing. So thanks for coming on. Tell everybody where to find your show, and I'll put the link up here again too.
Yeah, I'll pull it up. So you can find me anywhere you stream podcasts. My podcast is The Case for a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm going to pull a link up right now, actually, to my.
I got a link right here for everybody in the comments. It's Spotify, and just type in, a case for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, where do I see it right here in the chat. I'm going to put the link. I actually put the link to my Louis Tion episode right here. And once you go there, you can find all my other episodes.
Yeah. And a great follow on X too, if you're on there and you want to talk baseball, or Blue Sky, and go out and have conversations with my man Russell here. It's been great talking to you. Anything in closing before we wrap this up?
I just want to say thanks a lot, Pete. I'm going to be I took a weekend off visiting my family, so I'm going to do a recap of the Classic Era ballot, and I'll get back into the players that are on the Baseball Writers Association of America ballot. And then we'll see who gets in January. We already got Dick Allen and Dave Parker. I'm super excited. I don't get off on it, but Dave Parker, I'm a big Dave Parker fan, got my t-shirt. So I'm super happy that he got in and Dick Allen got in. I was hoping Tommy John would get in, but I think he'll eventually get in. But anyway, you listen to my episodes.
I hope he gets in before he dies too. I hate it when they put him in posthumously. Like, damn it, let him enjoy it even for a year.
I talked about that in my episode. I don't have a problem with prioritizing the living players. Tommy John's, I think, 83, is in his 80s.
He's
so
old.
Parker's in his 70s with Parkinson's disease. So it's like, we got to get this guy in. I'm so glad he's there.
Yeah, it's time. All right, well, I'm going to wrap this thing up. Everybody else, take care. Have a great day, and I will see you all later.
All right.